This is a one-page behavior model that can help you to make your habits more effortless and also to stop procrastination. When I say behavior in behavior model, I mean anything from habits to normal tasks that you need to do. That's why I said it is also applicable to procrastination. I learned these things from Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg, which is a very good book. But of course, I made some modifications and also I put all of these things in this one-page format. So this one-page format is mine, and also I made some modifications in the process. Using the things that I'm about to share and also the things that I mentioned in a previous video, I have built some habits that once were my dream. So for example, today is day 66 of 2 of my habits, and also day 50 of 1 of my habits, and day 45 of 2 other habits of mine. By the way, I didn't mention these numbers to boast. No, I don't like that kind of characteristic, and also I don't like the people who boast. But the reason I mention these numbers is because, for example, when I want to listen to someone and take some advice from someone, I want to see whether that thing is going to work or not. So the reason I mentioned these numbers was that I wanted to say that these things, at least for me, they worked. I don't know about you, but they worked for me. At least for me, they worked. Anyway, let's start. So first of all, let's talk about MAP, which is the foundation of BJ Fogg behavior model. So MAP means motivation, ability, and prompt. So in order to explain this, as you can see here, we have a chart, and on the x-axis we have ability, and on the y-axis we have motivation. And as you can see, this is positive and this is negative. This is negative for motivation and this is positive for motivation. And it's very obvious that, for example, positive for ability means that thing is easy. And negative for ability means that thing is hard. And for example, negative for motivation means your motivation is low, and positive for motivation means your motivation is high. And this is an action line, which as you can see, it's like a smiley face. And everything below this action line is those behaviors that you're not going to do them. And those actions, those behaviors that are above this action line are those behaviors that you're going to do them. But what does it mean? It means that if you want to do a hard behavior, you can only do that hard behavior when you have a lot of motivation. But if you want to do an easy behavior, you can do that easy behavior with different ranges of motivation. You can do that with high level of motivation, with medium level of motivation, and also with low level of motivation. Let's take reading as an example. And for making our habits more effortless, we need to analyze our habits using this one page. And as you can see, the first thing on this page is map. I mean, we should ask those questions related to motivation, ability, and prompt. So let's start. So the first question is, okay, when it comes to reading, what is the problem? Is it motivation? I mean, the first element, is it motivation? No. For reading, at least for me, it is not motivation because I already want to stick to that habit. I already want the reading habit. So no, the problem for me is not motivation. So let's talk about the second element, which is ability. But when it comes to analyzing ability, we need to talk about something called ability chain. Actually, BJ Fogg in his book, Tiny Habits, calls it ability chain. And this ability chain consists of 5 factors that he calls it the factors of ability, the ability factors. And those factors are time, money, physical effort, mental effort, and routine. Time, money, and physical effort are so obvious. But what about mental effort? Mental effort means that, for example, suppose that you want to cook, and for cooking, you don't know how to cook, or you don't know what to cook. So in that case, there is a kind of mental effort. And let's talk about another example, which is very common. At least for me, it's very common. Let's talk about another example for mental effort. And before that, I should mention that all of these things that we are talking about are not necessarily for habits, but they are applicable to other areas such as procrastination. So all of these things are also applicable to procrastinations because, again, in procrastination, we want to do some behaviors, but we constantly procrastinate those behaviors. So we can use this model for procrastination as well. Anyway, so one of the things that can lead to procrastination is not having mental clarity, which is actually the mental effort. For example, suppose that I want to record these videos. If I don't have any video ideas, so in that case, I'm not having clarity And that's actually a kind of mental effort. I don't know what should I talk about. So in that case, it would be a mental effort. This is another example of mental effort that I'm sure it's very common. And a lot of content creators struggle with this thing. And the last factor in this ability chain is routine. And for this, we should ask this question. We should ask, okay, does it fit into our current routine? And maybe you say, okay, could you please give some examples? Yes, I will. But you should wait a minute, because all of these things that we're going to talk about, for example, reading, exercising, and these kinds of examples, all of them have this factor, this element in them. So I will talk about it. So please wait a minute. I will give some examples about routine. So back to the topic. We were talking about our reading habit, and we asked a couple of questions. We asked, okay, what is the problem? Is it motivation? No, it is not motivation, because I already want to stick to my reading habit. I already want to build that habit. So it is not motivation. What about ability? And for ability, we asked these questions. We should check the ability chain. So let's check each of these things one by one. So first of all, when it comes to reading habit, what is the problem? Is it time? Maybe you say, yes, for example, time is one of those problems because I don't have time for reading. Okay. I myself don't consider time as one of the factors, but maybe some people do. Maybe some people do consider time as one of the reasons that they cannot stick to their reading habit. But anyway, let's add this thing. Let's suppose that time is one of those factors that is hindering you, that is stopping you from building that habit. So let's add this to this box. This red box is for problems. That's why it is in red. So let's add this into this red box. It is time. Okay, now let's continue. Okay, what other problems can you think of when you're talking about reading? Okay, what is a problem? Is it money? No, of course, money is not one of those problems, because when it comes to reading, you don't need any money for sticking to reading habit. So what about physical effort? No, reading doesn't need any physical effort. What about mental effort? No, reading doesn't need any mental effort. What about routine? Yes. One of the key reasons that, for example, I myself could not stick to my reading habit, because reading was not a part of my routine. Reading was not, for example, I didn't have any place for reading in my day. Yes, for example, sometimes I were doing it in the morning. Sometimes I was reading in the afternoon. Sometimes I was reading at night, and so on. But there wasn't a specific time in my day that I would assign that a specific time for reading. So yes, one of those things that I think is one of the key elements when it comes to reading habit is routine. So let's add a routine to this red box. So this red box is a collection of all of the problems that we can think of when it comes to building that habit. And when you look at it, when you look at this ability chain, we have covered all of these things. So as I've said, yes, we included the time in this box. But when it comes to money, no, I think money is not one of those reasons that we cannot stick to our reading habit. Physical effort is not one of those reasons. Mental effort is not one of those reasons, but routine was one of those reasons. So I added to this red box. So far we have listed some problems related to the ability factor. But now we need to try to think of some solutions for solving these problems. And for doing so, we are going to use PAC. So we are going to use PAC for the ability factor, because so far we have listed the problems related to ability factor. So we are going to use PAC for ability factors. So now we are going to talk about how to use PAC in order to solve these problems related to ability. And this is called design phase. The previous phase was called analysis phase, because we were analyzing and we were trying to think of some problems related to ability, and we were trying to list all of those things in this red box. But now we are going to design all of these things, and we're going to think of some solutions for solving those problems. So that's why it is called design phase. Anyway, so in order to fix those problems for ability, we want to use PAC. PAC means person, action, and context. So let me explain. The first component in PAC is person, which when it comes to ability, it means can you increase your skills? And by the way, remember that all of these things that we're talking about are for PAC model. Remember that we are not talking about a reading habit yet. After explaining about this PAC model, after that, we will talk about a reading example as well, because if you remember, we have listed some problems related to our reading habit, and we wanted to solve those problems using PAC. But first of all, we need to explain PAC, and then we can talk about how we can use that for solving those problems. So let's talk about PAC itself. The first component of PAC is person. And when it comes to ability factor, it means can you increase your skills? And this by itself can be divided into two main categories. The first category is that sometimes you can do some research in order to increase your skills. For example, maybe you can take some courses, maybe you can research that online or whatever. So you can do some stuff like this in order to increase your skills. For example, suppose that you want to cook and you don't know how to cook. So in that case, you can research. But the second category is that when you do a behavior over time, your skills will improve in that behavior. So the more you do it, the easier it gets because your skills will improve as you do it over time. So now let's talk about the third component, which is context. And I know that I haven't talked about the action component yet, but we will talk about it after the context component. So first of all, let's talk about the context component. After that, we will talk about the action component. So when it comes to context and when it comes to the ability factor, it means can you get tools, resources, help, and these kinds of things from your context, from your environment? Can you get tools, resources, or help from your context? For example, one of the things that happened to me is that, for example, recently I learned that I can use some tools in order to make these recordings, recording these videos, more effortless. So that is one of the examples of getting tools and resources and help from your context in order to increase your ability. And the third component is action. But what does action mean? Action means making the behavior tinier. And when it comes to making the behavior tinier, there are a couple of things that you can do. And all of those things fall into two categories. The first one is a starter step, and the second one is a scaling back. Let's explain the scaling back first. After that, we will talk about the starter step. When it comes to scaling back, for example, suppose that you want to start exercising habit. So if you start with, for example, 30 minutes a day, in that case, that would be hard. But if you scale it back, if you make it tinier and say, for example, you want to start with 5 minutes a day, that would be a better choice because you are not used to even starting with 5 minutes a day, let alone 30 minutes a day. So if you shoot for 30 minutes a day, probably you're going to fail because you're not used to that kind of thing. And also another example is recording these videos. Suppose that I want to record these videos in one session. In that case, that would be very hard. But the other thing that I can do is to record these videos in different days and also in different times of the day. For example, I don't know whether you have noticed or not, but if you paid attention to, for example, the lighting, my beard growth, and these kinds of things, you can clearly see that I've recorded this video in different days and also in different times of the day, because recording this whole video in one session, that would be very hard. So these were two examples of scaling back. Starting with a smaller version of that habit or behavior. Remember that all of these things you're talking about are not necessarily about habits. They're about behaviors. So they're also applicable to, for example, procrastination. But what is a starter step? For every behavior, we need to do some actions, some mini actions to complete that behavior. So for every behavior, we need to do some mini actions, some tiny actions, one after another, so that we can complete that action, that behavior. And among these actions, among these tiny actions, there are some of them which are more important, because if you do those things, probably you will continue and do the rest of that behavior. So let me give you one example. For example, for recording these videos, so the first starter step is turning on the computer. After that, I should set up the camera and lighting. After that, I should prepare what to say. And after that, I should press record and film for a few seconds. If I do these four starter steps only up to this point, I mean, pressing record and film for a few seconds, I can guarantee, I'm definitely sure that I will continue and I will record at least for 20 minutes, at least for 10 minutes. I'm definitely sure. So these are called starter steps. And for example, when it comes to a habit like brushing your teeth, for example, for me, if I do two things, picking up the toothbrush, after that picking up the toothpaste itself, if I do these two tiny actions, I can guarantee that I will continue doing this behavior. So these are the starter steps, and the first one is a starter step, which BJ Fogg in his book Tiny Habits talk about it. But for me, I think it's better to define starter steps. For example, for me, if I turn on the computer, probably I will not start recording these videos. If I set up the camera and lighting, yeah, it would be better, but probably I'm not going to start recording the video. If I prepare what to say, yes, the probability of doing the action increases. But if I press record and film for a few seconds, I can guarantee that I will continue. So for me, these 4 starter steps are the key ones. If I do these 4 tiny actions, I can guarantee that I will do the rest. So BJ Fogg in his book talk about a starter step, but I think it's better to generalize his concept and say starter steps. So now let's go back to our reading habit, our example. So if you remember, we listed these problems when we were talking about the ability factor. And then we decided that we need to use the PAC model in order to think of some solutions for these problems. So let's do that. So I've already explained the PAC model. So when it comes to the reading habit, okay, can I increase my skills? No, I cannot do that. Can I get tools and resources? No, I cannot do that. Can I make the behavior tinier? Yes, I can do that. For example, I can use the starter step or scaling back or both of them. So let's suppose that I want to do this thing. So for example, here, in this green box, which are the solutions that we can think of. So we list some things, some solutions, some possible things that we can do in order to fix and in order to solve these problems. One of them is that, okay, we can make the behavior tiny. For example, we can define 3 levels, as I explained in the previous video. And for example, we can set the ceiling version as 5 minutes. If you don't know what do I mean by ceiling version, floor version, emergency version, these 3 levels, you can watch the previous video. But anyway, the general idea is making the behavior tinier. So far we have listed some problems related to the ability factor and used the PAC model for, thinking of some solutions for these problems related to the ability factor. So we finished the ability factor, so let's put it aside and let's go to the next factor, which is prompt. And I'm sure that some people would say, okay, what about routine? I will explain it. We will explain about what we can do for routine when it comes to prompts, so you should wait a minute. But anyway, we finished the ability factor, we listed the problems, and also we used the PAC model to think of some solutions that popped into our mind for these things. So we finished the ability factor in this behavior model, and we need to go to the next step, which is prompt. There are 3 types of prompts. The acronym is PAC, person, action, and context. So the first one is person prompt, which means there is some stuff in our body that prompts us, that reminds us that we need to do a behavior. For example, when we get hungry, when we get thirsty, or when we want to go to WC, toilets, and these kinds of things. The next one is context prompt. By the way, I will explain the action prompt after explaining context prompt. So context prompt means there is some stuff in our environment, in our context, that prompts us, that reminds us of doing some behaviors. For example, notifications on social media, or for example, when we set an alarm, or for example, when we put some sticky notes, and these kinds of things are context prompts. For some behaviors and habits, yes, we do need context prompts, but there are 2 problems with context prompts. The first one is that as time passes, they become overwhelming, especially when you have a lot of context prompts. And second of all, is that your mind will try and will learn to ignore those context prompts. For example, the first day or so that you put those sticky notes on your computer, probably your mind will notice those things. But as time passes, your mind will learn to ignore all of those sticky notes. So you need to change them frequently, those context prompts, so that your mind will notice them. Otherwise, As time passes, you will learn to ignore those context prompts. But what does action prompt mean? Action prompt means after doing this action, I will do another action. For example, I myself in the morning, when I brush my teeth, after that, I do some exercises. And after that, I read a couple of pages. And after that, I will review my flashcards. So as you can see, there is action A. And after action A, you do another action. You do another behavior. So after action A, I will do action B. And this action A is called anchor because it acts as an anchor that you do another action, action B, after this anchor. And this anchor acts like a reminder, like a prompt. So that's why we call it action prompt. And BJ Fogg says that this is one of the best kind of prompts. He says that, for example, on one side, you have some habits or some behaviors that you want to build. And on the other side, you already have some anchors. For example, you go to toilet, you brush your teeth every day, and these kinds of things. You already have some anchors in your life. And he says you can match these two things. I mean, you can match those behaviors, those habits that you want to build with your current anchors. For example, one of the things that he has done for himself is that he decided to do 2 push-ups after going to toilet. So this is an anchor, and this is doing those push-ups is an action, a behavior, a habit that he wants to build. So he matches these 2 things. But when it comes to matching these things together, you need to pay attention to a couple of notes, a couple of things. So the first one is that, for example, if you want to build a habit or do a behavior that only happens once in a day. So for example, you should not choose going to toilet because you go to toilet more than once a day. So you should pay attention to the frequency of these 2 actions. The other thing is that they should match in terms of place as well. For example, if you want to do a behavior or if you want to build a habit related to garage, I mean something that you do in the garage, you should not choose an anchor which happens in the kitchen. So far we have talked about prompts and 3 types of prompts, but now we want to talk about our reading habit, our example. And let's see whether we can use each of these things for our reading habit. The first one is person prompt. Can I use person prompt for my reading habit? No, I cannot use that. What about action prompt? Yes, I can definitely use that. For example, no matter how much I made my reading habit, my exercising habit is smaller and tinier, I couldn't stick to my reading habit and exercising habit. But as soon as I chose an action prompt, I could stick to those. Because for example, suppose that you say, okay, I want to read for even 5 minutes in a day, or I want to exercise for 5 minutes in a day. Even if you want to do that for 5 minutes, okay, when should I do that thing? This is very important. If you don't know when you should do that behavior, probably you're not going to do that. In my opinion, this action prompt is really powerful, and also it's very important. If you remember, when we were listing some problems related to our reading habits, one of the things that we listed was routine. I mean, that reading habit doesn't fit into our current lifestyle. So how can we fit that behavior into our current lifestyle? One of the things that we can use is action prompt. So we can use action prompt for fitting that behavior into our current lifestyle. And for me, it was very powerful, and this was a thing that helped me to stick to my exercising habit and also my reading habit. So let's add this action prompt to this green box as well, and let's continue. So what about context prompt? Can we use context prompt for our reading habit? Yes, we can definitely use context prompt for our reading habit. For example, I remember that when I was building some of my habits, one day I forgot to do one of those behaviors, one of those habits. I forgot. I did have time and I wanted to do that behavior, but I forgot to do that behavior. So even in the previous video, I said one of the things that I could do is to put my habit trackers in my bed so that whenever I want to go to bed, I see those habit trackers and see, oh, I need to do these. I need to check at least, okay, whether I have done this habit or not. And this acts as a reminder, as a prompt, so that it reminds me that I need to do that behavior, that I need to do that habit. So this is a kind of context prompt. And yes, so I can add this context prompt to this green box as well. So if you remember, we talked about ability factor and also the pack for ability factor. We talked about prompt and the pack for the prompt factor. But we didn't talk about motivation that much because motivation is unreliable, and probably we're not going to talk about it a lot. But in order to complete our explanation, in order to complete this puzzle, let's talk about 3 types of motivation. And again, we have PAC. So we have 3 types of motivation, which is person, action, and context. The first one is person, which means the person himself or herself already wants to do the action. But the second one is action, which means an external benefit or punishment causes the person to do that behavior, for example, such as taxes. For example, people don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to pay my taxes. No. It's because of those punishments that they pay their taxes. And the third type of motivation is context prompt. For example, you can see that some people tend to stick to their exercising habit when they do it in a group. I mean, those group exercises. Or, for example, some people tend to read more when they read with other people. I mean, those book clubs and these kinds of things. So far we talked about motivation, ability, and prompt factors, and also we talked about PAC for each of them. So what about environment? Environment means, okay, can you think of some ways that you can redesign your environment so that you can make your habit, your behavior more effortless? And when it comes to celebration, BJ Fogg focuses on celebration a lot in his book, and he says that even according to research, if you celebrate after doing that behavior or that habit, you will stick to that habit, you will build that habit faster. At least in the beginning phases, you need to celebrate. And these celebrations can be anything that sounds natural to you. For example, for someone, saying something, for example, such as yes, and these kinds of things sounds more natural, but for some other people, some other things would sound more natural. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.